It's live.
Right on.
Awesome. Well, everybody, welcome to Say What, the place where you ask and we answer your questions about God, the Bible, and the Christian faith. My name is Tim Peace, and I'm joined here. I should say, as always, but Aaron and Aaron have been out back-to-back weeks, but joined here usually by my good friends Aaron Adams and Aaron Thatcher. And so we are continuing on our kind of hodgepodge series of Say What, where we've been looking at the difficult sayings of Jesus. I only say hodgepodge because we are trying to be a bridge between weeks of our message series at Mount Carmel Christian Church called Let's Talk About It, where we've been talking about matters that people have questions about, whether they be matters of faith or matters of culture. And so we've been doing that. We were just talking offline. We kind of do a little huddle and run through our notes and things beforehand. And this is the first time that we actually have one of our preaching team guys that did the message, and now we're going to talk about the subject of his message, and that's Aaron Adams here. Now
you get to grill me.
I jokingly said he's our sex expert because that's what we talked about on Sunday. But
I hate you.
Leave your questions in the chat, everybody.
Yes. Send him the email at dbacon@Mount Carmel. I'm just kidding.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right on.
If Dee Dee's watching, he'll get that joke. Anyway, so we're thrilled. We've kind of told you each week we're going to be getting into some stuff that might make folks uncomfortable to talk about, and that'll probably just continue on through the rest of the series. But it's important to talk about these things, A, because they're on people's minds, B, because they're not really talking about issues, but you're talking about real people and real life matters that people live and breathe every day, and C, and more importantly, we want to know, how does our faith influence and intersect with these matters that we deal with on a day-to-day basis? And so that's kind of where we're coming from with this. So I'm going to let Aaron have the first word. Maybe you can summarize a little bit what you did in your message, or maybe a big takeaway that you had from preparing all this stuff.
Sure. Well, I mean, so the original question surrounding our series, each week there's kind of a question,
Right.
So it's the let's talk about it, and then we have, the sub weekly topics, I guess, the subtopics if you want, and then there's always a question kind of within that. I think we've done that at least. Well, we had the last couple of weeks, and this week the question was, is sex love? Right, and that's kind of a loaded question, and I think it's a loaded topic because there's a lot of different information, there's a lot of different opinions, there's a lot of cultural context that goes into it when you're talking about the Old Testament that carries into the New Testament. Right. And that then we have our own cultural context in which we work and frame our opinions based on what we experience today, what we've learned growing up, whether you grew up in the church or you didn't grow up into the church, whether your parents talked to you about this subject or you just kind of figured it out on your own. And so that question was, is sex love? And maybe might talk about that a little bit tonight, but all in all, my answer was no, that it's not. I think sex can be used in the right way, and this is what we talked about in the message. How did God design this? God created it. God created all things to be good. And used in the godly context, the way God intended, sex can be good. But just like most things, like anything, when it's taken out of context or used in a way that it wasn't intended by God, it can be hurtful and it can't be good. And so the question is, sex love? Not necessarily. It can be a good, powerful expression of love. It's a piece of the puzzle. But sex and love don't necessarily have to go hand in hand at all. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I mean that answers my question. even better than I could have imagined.
Yeah, sure.
No, it was good. It was good. Yeah, Thatch, what do you think? You when we were talking offline, you had some interesting Jesus saying insights that you
Yeah,
kind
man.
of brought to our attention.
Well, because we're still technically doing the Jesus saying series, I thought it would be appropriate if we're talking about intimacy and intercourse to bring up some of what Jesus had to say on the topic, which actually was pretty diverse. And we actually, this is one of those cool cases where you see what Jesus taught about
Hmm.
sex and marriage and love, and then you actually see how he interacted with people who behaved sometimes in accordance with what he taught and sometimes not, and you get a cool vibe of how he approached and interacted with those people. So in its essence, Jesus, and we talked to Tim and I talked a bit last week about in our talk about gender, how Jesus was pretty hardline on marriage rules in his time. That when the Pharisees asked, when is it okay for man and woman to get a divorce? You know, Moses said this was okay. Jesus basically said, no, we don't do that. So Jesus definitely was one who enforced the marriage values of his time. But when in terms of sexual intimacy, which in that culture was, we were just saying earlier, was intimately related with marriage relationships. I mean, it wasn't like today where there was any sense of separation between those things. You get lines like what Jesus says in Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount: anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart.
Yeah.
And I mean, it really doesn't get any stronger than that. It's like it because then, because I think previous to that, the sense was like, well, if I don't actually, as long as I'm not actually in bed with somebody, we're not entering the realm of sin. But Jesus's thing was like, listen, man, you can't even think about like it introduces this whole theme of like there are thoughts you can have that are taboo, that are sinful, you know. Which is complicating because it's you know, that's a difficult, a truly challenging thing to manage. But what you actually say, so what I should say is that seems really hardline,
Right.
and it is. The requirements for Christians regarding sex and marriage are pretty intense. But the other truth is that when you see Jesus interacting with people, his love and his classic generosity comes out. One great example of this is in John 8, which I'll actually pull it up and read it here. It's in John 8:2-11. I'm reading out of the NIV, which I know takes some liberties that Tim might take offense at, but I think it reads pretty good.
I'm not offended by it.
No, man, I kid. But yeah, John 8:2. At dawn, Jesus appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground, weirdly enough. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." You know, I think, because if you just had Jesus' commandments, that sounds pretty much like law. It's hard. It's hard. But when you see Jesus interact with this woman, there's just so much gentleness that he forgives her, even in the midst of her sin. I think. What do you guys think about that? I think that's pretty awesome. It's just a cool moment.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, you know, you pointed out the weirdness of the writing, you know, the writing in the sand. It's like the first century Palestinian mic drop. I don't know. It's like Jesus is exuding confidence, which it takes some confidence and risk actually, because he's fortunate that there were no people in that scenario that were audacious enough to claim that they were sinless, because if they were, that lady would have been hit by a rock,
Mhm.
and that would not have been good. But and I think that's the power of the story, is that Jesus doesn't deny the sinfulness of the act. So he
No.
hasn't contradicted the moral imperative you brought up before
Mhm.
from the Sermon on the Mount. But he also exudes a grace imperative in the same sense in his response. He doesn't let anybody else off the hook in the process, because he basically says, what business do you have carrying out some sort of corporal punishment when you're just as sinful as you're claiming this person is? Jesus is wise to their shenanigans in the moment. I don't know if that's an appropriate term to use here, but
Yeah.
because the law itself probably would have compelled them to bring about both sinful parties in the adulterous relationship, and only the woman is dragged before Jesus. And then the last thing, though, that sticks out to me, and this kind of comes back to one of the earlier points that I just made, is that Jesus doesn't let down his guard on the sinfulness of the situation, because
Mhm.
while he lets her walk away, what does he close off with? Go and sin no more.
Yep.
In the story. And so I think one of the things that really hits home with me is that I don't, as a person of faith, this isn't me casting a judgment on what other people want to do or what their worldview is. But if I consider myself a follower of Jesus, I have no right to let down the moral imperative that Jesus teaches.
No.
But I also don't have any right to fail to show the grace and mercy that Jesus shows people that are just sinners like me and happen to have been kind of caught in this. And I think that's what I just said has become very cliche in our culture, especially in the so-called culture wars on matters like this.
Mhm.
But I think that it's really important to not lose sight of that, like the fact that the moral imperative and the grace can coexist, and they actually, for a person that follows Jesus, must coexist. You can't have one without the other in terms of being holistically following Jesus, and that's really, really hard. It's hard for the religious types that want to uphold the moral imperative, so much so that they want to picket anyone that falls out of line. And it's really hard for maybe the people that don't share the moral imperative worldview, that maybe want their own personal Jesus that's all grace and no moral imperative. And so they don't necessarily want to hear that side of him. And it's a side that shows up a lot, but both of them show up a lot, actually, if you read the Gospels. And I think that's the impressive thing there, and the thing that sticks out to me. What about you, Aaron?
No, I was gonna say something very similar. I think it's that's not the first time that Jesus did something like that.
Yeah.
We kind of see that throughout his history. We kind of see that as a characteristic of Jesus, the way that he taught and the way that he led. But it shows, I think sometimes in culture, we so often look at others, at their wrongdoing, and instead of wanting to correct them for their own well-being, we want to correct them because it elevates us. And that's really what Jesus is getting at. That's why he asked the question: if you're without sin, okay, go ahead and cast the stone. Go ahead, whatever. But obviously nobody was. Nobody was willing to say that they were. So they all left. But on the equal side, as to what you're saying, Tim, the way that Jesus leaves off is go and sin no more. And so it's not, I think, and that's another culture thing that I feel like, whether it's my own feelings at times or things that I hear of, well, Jesus will just keep forgiving me.
Mhm.
right? And I think there is an aspect of forgiveness, but Jesus is not condoning what she did, but saying, hey, strive for what's godly. um, and so I agree that they coexist. You have the grace and love, but you also have the side of, hey, I know that you can do this. It is possible
Yes.
for you to do this, so strive for what is godly instead of for what's not.
Yeah. You're right. And that just extracts a general theme about Jesus' ministry that I love, because it kind of takes a little weight off sometimes, is that like people are just not ever going to get justice perfectly right.
Right.
Humanity is not capable of that. So all that you can hope to do as a flawed human being is that you're going to go on another day, and maybe tomorrow I will sin less out of respect to the God who put me here in the first place. And then at the end, that's when justice happens and rights don't get wrong, wrongs get righted.
Right,
But
right.
yeah, so it's encouraging, but it's also kind of spooky, because that's a big charge
Mhm.
Yeah.
to look for that woman to look from that day into the rest of her life and say, well, all right, you know, how are we gonna clean this up? It's a big
Absolutely.
Yeah.
challenge.
And Aaron, you said something that brings up a question I think a lot of people might be thinking or ask, and it's you made the comment about that we often don't for lack of a better term, call out another person's sin for their own well-being, but
Yep.
because the sin makes us uncomfortable.
Mhm.
But
Well, and I
how do
think a
you,
lot of times we mask it in that.
yeah,
Well, I'm calling this person out because it's truth and love,
right.
right? And not to say that that doesn't ever happen, but I
Mhm.
think a lot of times it's not always to build somebody up. It's at
Right.
least not in this case. It's let's tear her down
Yeah.
and let's see what Jesus has to say about it.
Yeah, no, and that's actually exactly kind of one of the sides that I was going to go with, a question I was going to ask for all of us to kind of ponder, and that is, what do you do about the fact that, so on one hand, like you just pointed out, people will dress it up as if I'm looking out for someone else's own good, but again, they're either uncomfortable or they just really love pointing the finger at someone else so that it doesn't come back at them. But then on the other side of the coin, especially with this particular topic, um, you know, and I want to be very careful how I say this, because I really, really hate when people talk about like our modern taboos and issues and modern culture as if we've gone down we're at the bottom of some slippery slope. Make no mistake. Uh, go back and study first century Rome, and you won't be thinking of it. It'll just be more of a straight line of just nonsense. Anyway, the point is though, is that you still deal with the fact that people may be living in whatever their expression of their sexuality or their wants or desires, whatever, what have you. They may be living that out, and they might think, well, this is good for my well-being. So they might come back to the Christian and say, well, what gives you the right to tell me what's good for me? You say you're looking out, even if I give you that you believe you're looking out for me, you don't know what's good for me in that scenario. And I think that, and what do you guys think about that? How would you wrestle, I guess, with both of those sides, both the person that really isn't looking out for someone's well-being, and then the person that might say, well, I know what's good for me, and you don't get to determine that. More of a relativistic kind of thought. Anything come to mind there? I know that's loaded.
Yeah, well, it's applicable to a lot of different things in
Mhm.
life, right? And I think it's a tough question, and I don't know if there's necessarily a right answer. Maybe you guys think differently. I don't know. I think it's a really good question. I think it's very relevant, and I think it's definitely a question for us to wrestle with. I think for me, I think it comes down to our heart for the person,
Mhm.
right? And I think a lot goes to how you communicate to somebody.
Yeah.
you know,
Mhm.
what's your relationship with that person, and are your motives pure? And I think we have to ask that question anytime we're going to have a tough conversation with somebody that may be living life differently than what we think
Mhm.
God would have, right?
Right.
Um, and so, yeah, and then like to get down to it, it really comes. Okay, do we? And we've talked about this before. Do we believe what Scripture has to say?
Mhm.
And is what's said in Scripture, is that relevant to us today?
Right.
And obviously, if you would say it is, then you would hopefully strive to live in a way that would be honoring to God.
Right.
And there are people out there that would have the opinion that no, it's not relevant to me today, and so I'm going to live this way. It's different, and so that's where I think the attentions arise. But I
Right.
think the way that we communicate to those people in our lives goes a really, really long way
Hmm.
um, in those relationships.
Cool. What about you, Fetch?
Yeah, I have a mentor of mine who's a discipleship minister on the other side of town, who I was just talking with him the other day about the value of there are different kinds of capital in our lives that we can use to engage with people, and all of them ultimately. So you have things like, how do you use your physical capital, like your liquid capital, your money, but then there's also like relational capital, and all those things have an exchange rate for like this ultimate spiritual capital, which is the goal that Jesus sets for us for spiritual life on earth, which in the end pays, quote, pays out, if you're going to follow out that metaphor. I don't always love using the money metaphor for that stuff
Right.
at the end. But he was pointing out that in any kind of evangelism, and I kind of consider this kind of spiritual correction to be in a similar school,
Mhm.
to reinforce what Aaron said, you have to have a certain amount of relational capital built up with someone. You have to invest enough into someone to prove that you genuinely, because you can't just say, I mean, you're not going to give lip service and say to your coworker or whoever you barely know, hey man, I care about you and I just want to tell you, I really think you're going to go to hell because you're doing it. Like that's just like what there's nothing, there's no exchange being made there
I don't know, man.
because there's nothing to
He's won
exchange.
me over. You can tell me I'm going to hell with that tone all day, and
there's
I'm
no there's no trade happening there.
right.
It, so, and for every relationship you're in, it's different, but that's probably just a long-winded way to say I affirm what Aaron is saying, that sometimes you have to let that stew for a really long time.
Yeah.
Some people, before you can even begin to have deep discussions, like you have to invest in your relationship. Probably the number one way to get to a place where you can safely, genuinely correct people in love is to build a strong relationship with that person.
Yeah. So it's
Yeah.
it's interesting because I've given a lot of thought to different to the kind of the different aspects or avenues of this kind of question, and one that we as the church don't do a great job of observing is something that comes up in 1 Corinthians 5. So Aaron's message, he talked about 1 Corinthians 7 and a lot of the teaching there, but effectively in 1 Corinthians 5, there's an interesting scenario going on with a congregant of one of the churches in Corinth, and Paul deals with this in the letter, and this person, in what many of us today might consider a heavy-handed way. He suggests booting the guy out of the church, and in our modern church culture where we're all about getting as many people in the door as possible, it doesn't seem that palatable. But Paul says something in 1 Corinthians 5, and this is where it gets interesting. He says, this is starting at verse 9 of chapter 5. It says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral persons, not at all meaning the immoral of this world, or the greedy, and robbers, or idolaters, since you would then need to go out of the world. But now I'm writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother or sister in Christ, this is implying here, who is sexually immoral or greedy, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, and robber. Do not even eat with such a one. So again, heavy-handed, but I want to clue you in on something here, and this is one of the things that we don't often consider in this discussion. Oftentimes, and I'm going to caricature a random church person here, but oftentimes I see random churchgoer, whether they are talking in a small group about the ills of the world, maybe they're blasting their opinions out on Facebook. Friends, don't blast your opinions out on Facebook. It's not good. Anyway, and what was that?
Let's say it louder for the people in the back.
Yes, don't blast out your opinions on Facebook. Nobody cares. Anyway, but anyway, here the reason I bring this up is that we oftentimes as Christians, as church-going type people, we worry about the ills of the world around us. We talk about, we don't talk about the people, by the way, we talk about the issues and we caricature people out in the world. And Paul basically says, I'm not dealing with this issue because it's somebody out in the world. I'm dealing with this issue because it's a brother or sister in the faith that's claiming to be a follower of Jesus, claiming to be amongst us, and they're blatantly like living off the range. And let's get down to business. What this person was doing is basically, it was a guy that was sleeping with his father's wife. So not his mom, but it's weird. Okay, yeah. Let's just call it what it is. And you get the impression that not only is this guy completely fine with the thing that he's doing that he shouldn't be doing, but Paul kind of implies that at the least the Corinthian church is putting up with this guy's bad behavior and still embracing him in fellowship. At worst, they're being kind of celebratory about it. And I think where this becomes a difficult subject matter for us is we talk a lot about being worried about the sins and the taboos of the world around us, and don't often focus within, both on an individual level. Like, I do believe it's Jesus that said to take the plank out of your own eye before you worry about the speck in somebody else's. But not just as an individual, because the New Testament's very rarely worried about individuals. They're worried about the church body, which we as individuals are a part of. And so as a person of faith, that whole idea of brother and sister, I think ties into what you guys have been talking about relationships and genuine care. If it's someone that I know, that I love, that I care about, that I'm friends with, we share common faith, and I see that person going a direction that both of us have kind of agreed that we don't want to go because we want to share common faith and go on that path of faith, then it's incumbent on me out of love to bring that person back in step with the faith. But the person that doesn't share my faith, the person that doesn't have the same worldview as me, for me to assume that they're going to buy hook, line, and sinker my sexual ethics as I find them or believe them be rooted in the Bible is kind of preposterous for me to even assume that. And then not only is that a bit preposterous, but then add to that I have the audacity to call them out on something that they don't even view as being wrong. That's not a good way to start off a relationship. And notice that Jesus didn't fully form Peter as a sent out one to go change the world when he was calling him in the fishing boat to follow him. He got dirty, worked all night, foot in his mouth, imperfect, gonna deny knowing him 3 times, Peter, at the time. And that's the guy he called. And I think, having that moral imperative and grace imperative as believers means we, as members of the faith, uphold the moral imperatives of Jesus in our lives and in our fellow members of faith's lives. But when it comes to the grace proposition, well, we don't expect someone else to be cleaned up and look just like we think they should look before meeting the actual one that can do the cleaning up, so to speak. And I think that's, yeah. So it's an interesting thing, and that would go for any of the avenues that here in 2020 that we would go down the road on any sexual ethics, which I know there are many, and we haven't even gotten into necessarily the specifics. And I don't know that we really need to dabble in the specifics to live out the kind of Jesus ethic we're talking about here. In fact, if we're overly worried about the specifics, we're probably missing that point right now. So yeah, I don't know.
That was good.
Thatch, did you see? Do we have any questions out there on internet land?
No, we do not have any. I did say hi to Arlen though.
All right. Hey Arlen. Glad you tuned in, man.
Cool.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably it, unless you guys have anything else to add on.
No, I think
it was a good conversation for sure. I enjoyed that.
Yeah.
So so next week we'll be back for more. Tune in to our online service. We'll actually be doing on site. If you missed it, Dee Dee did like a what to expect in the month of July video that I believe is on our YouTube channel. So if you haven't seen that, check it out. And if you are comfortable with coming to church in the flesh, go ahead and register online. But if you're not yet, we'll still be broadcasting our service live online and on demand thereafter. So you can watch. I think we're going to be talking about matters of the spiritual realm, spiritual warfare, zombies, maybe. I don't know.
Paranormal.
The paranormal. Okay.
Oh, yes.
So we'll get into that next week and just continue to have more of these interesting and intense discussions. But in the meantime, we'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in to Say What, and we'll see you later.
See you guys.
Have a good week.